What's the most unexplainable experience you've ever witnessed? I have a bit of a reverse one. Back in the 80s, emptying a water bed by siphoning with a hose out the window of an apartment. Everything is going great, and once the thing has been totally emptied, look out the window to see no water on the ground outside. Look closer and notice the person in the apartment below left their window open. The hose had curled into someone else's apartment, and the contents of an entire waterbed flooded their place. So somewhere out there, there's a person who came home to an apartment that was completely flooded with water for no apparent reason.
That's wild. Just imagine coming home to find your place soaked because of some random hose from above. I can picture the confusion on their face. Might have been a bit of a headache for the person living below. Guess it's a lesson in apartment living and water safety. Not every day you deal with a surprise flood like that. Wonder how they handled it.
Was sleeping over at friend's small apt, mid-80s, on the floor in a sleeping bag between his bed and his little sister's bed. Middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, but not alarmed, just suddenly very clearly wide awake. A quiet man's voice in my head said, "You should get up and move." I don't remember even questioning it, or it seeming weird, so I got up, over my bag to the foot of his bed, and we'd back to sleep. Sometime later, early morning, there is this huge crash, and we all sit up, alarmed. His cat had jumped up and somehow taken down a shelf, holding this gigantic wooden 70s style stereo set. The kind with boxy wooden speakers, a turntable, cassette, and 8 tracks, etc. Probably 60 to 80 pounds of gear total. It fell maybe 4 feet and landed right where my head would have been. Mike yelled my name and rolled over, didn't see me down there, and looked around panicky-like, and of course I was down by his feet. We just stared for a second and soaked in the implications.
That's a wild story. Just waking up to a voice like that is something. The timing is crazy too. You're just chilling on the floor and then a heavy stereo almost lands on you. It definitely makes you think about how things could have gone down differently. I guess that moment changed how you see sleepovers or maybe even instincts. Sometimes, you just gotta trust those random feelings.
Many years ago, I was up in the attic of my parents' house. I slipped off of the boards and put my foot through the ceiling. When I looked through the hole that I had created, I saw the garage. That made no sense. I should have been looking at a carpeted hallway of the second floor, since I was on the other side of the house. I sat there for several minutes, trying to wrap my head around what I was looking at. Eventually, I thought, I must somehow be confused about where I was in the attic. I climbed down, walked out of my room, and there was the hole in the ceiling right where it should have been second floor carpeted hallway. It's been nearly 20 years, and I still can't figure out what happened.
That's a strange story. It's wild how your brain can mess with you like that. Being up in the attic can feel disorienting, and seeing a garage instead of a hallway must have been confusing. It's like your mind played a trick on you. It's kind of funny to think about it now, but I get why it stuck with you for so long. Some things just don't add up, and this seems to be one of them.
In high school, I went over to my girlfriend's house to hang out. We hadn't eaten dinner yet, and we were both getting pretty hungry, so we were unsuccessfully debating what we should eat. Suddenly, we hear a thump come from the kitchen, and since we were home alone, we went to investigate. One of the recipe books that her dad keeps on the refrigerator had fallen off, but it was like 7 feet away from the fridge and had opened to a certain page, chicken and mushrooms with rice. So I jokingly said, maybe we should make that. We checked the kitchen, and she had all the necessary ingredients. After we collected them, we turned to the stove, and there was already a large, clean skillet sitting on it, ready to go. My girlfriend claimed she hadn't done it, as she had washed all the dishes earlier that afternoon and put them all away. I thought that maybe she was just messing with me, but she was convincingly serious. So basically, some friendly ghost helped settle a small argument by saying, "Look, you dumb shits, cook this and shut the fuck up." It was delicious, by the way.
That's a pretty wild story. Sounds like a classic case of a ghost stepping in to help out. It's interesting how things just aligned in that moment. A thump, a recipe opening, and suddenly you've got dinner sorted. The fact that it turned out good is a nice bonus. It's cool to think about how random moments like that can just bring some fun to an ordinary night.
In college, I did the graveyard shift for my job, so I would be up all night and sleep during the day. On one of my days off, my roommate woke up in cold sweats and came out to the living room where I was watching TV. It was 3:46 a.m. He told me he had a dream where his grandfather died. He went back to sleep, and he got a phone call from his dad at about 7 a.m. His dad told him his grandfather died, and on the report it says his grandfather died at 3:46 a.m. I can't explain that, and that creeped me the fuck out.
That's a wild story. It's one of those moments that makes you question everything. The timing is just too precise to ignore. Dreams and reality can blur sometimes, and when they connect in a way like that, it definitely sends chills down your spine. You'd think it's just a coincidence, but it feels deeper. I've heard a few similar stories, and they always mess with your mind.
We were sitting around a friend's house watching TV, not doing much at all. The discussion turns to, what would you do if you found a genie's lamp? Kind of stuff. What one wish would you make? I said flippantly, I'd wish for some strawberries because I'd love some strawberries right now. Ha! A few minutes later, there is a knock at the door. My buddy goes to answer it. A few minutes later, he dashes into the TV room and says, AG and Kim, you gotta come here, man. I follow him out, and his mom is there with a basket of strawberries. He says, say that again, Mom. She looks a little strange and says, I was just driving here, and there was a guy on the side of the road selling strawberries, and I thought you and your friends might want some. We just look at each other and says, you blew it, man. You blew your wish on strawberries.
That's a funny story. Just chilling, talking about wishes, and then boom, strawberries show up. It's wild how life works like that. Your friend must have felt that was pretty ironic. It's a simple wish, but it turned into something real. Makes you think about what you'd actually want if a genie popped up. Sometimes, it's just the little things that stick with you, like a good laugh and some fresh fruit.
A barn full of mummified chickens, suspended from 20-foot rafters by their necks. Hundreds and hundreds of them, and all on individual ropes. 30 years ago, and I still think about it. Edit, wow, this blew up. To answer some questions, I'm not sure they were there to be prepared for food, as it would be way too much work to hang them all individually and with such long ropes. Plus, I can't imagine anyone wanting to eat a desiccated bird skeleton. The barn was abandoned and was knocked over for a new subdivision maybe a year after we found it.
That sounds pretty unsettling. I can see why it sticks with you after all these years. It's weird imagining a whole barn filled with mummified chickens like that. Definitely not something you come across every day. I wonder who thought to hang them all like that, and why. It must have felt really eerie to discover that in an old barn, especially knowing it was torn down shortly after.
Me and my mom were outside a coffee shop, and I noticed a large white bird in the sky. It was too high up to see it in detail, but the way it was circling suggested it was a hawk or eagle. My mom noticed me looking up and commented how she'd never seen a white bird like that. We watched it for about 30 seconds, and all of a sudden, it vanished into thin air. It creeped my mom out so much that she changes the subject whenever I mention it.
That's interesting. It's funny how moments like that can stick with people. Your mom's reaction just shows how some things can feel a bit off. It's like seeing something that doesn't fit the usual pattern. I wonder if she thinks about it when it crosses her mind. It's wild how a simple bird can change the vibe of a day. Definitely something to remember.
I once stayed in room 410 of the Queen and Hotel in San Francisco. Woke up in the middle of the night, needing to go to the bathroom, and saw what appeared like a decaying woman with withered flesh and a blue/white glow at the foot of the bed, seeming to stare at me, in spite of having eyes that were just black sunken holes. It was so terrifying I passed out. Woke up in the morning and told my girlfriend at the time about it. When she came over, she laughed, and when I asked why, she said she booked that room because the hotel was supposed to be haunted, that room specifically, and she was using me as a blind test case to see if it was true. Ended up staying there another 3 nights without anything odd happening.
That's a wild story. I mean, waking up to something like that would freak anyone out. Your girlfriend really pulled a prank, though. It's funny how she set you up just to test a ghost story. After passing out, I guess it was brave to stay there a few more nights. Must have been a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Good thing nothing else happened.
I might be too late, but this one was told to me by my mother. Her mother, my grandma, died in 1984, so I never got to meet her. She had an awesome life, began working as a model, then a flight attendant, then a news reporter, one of the first female journalists on air back in BR. Anyway, apparently the reason she quit flying was because in the 50s, when she had a layover in Buenos Aires, she and a coworker of hers went to see a palm reader. Or was it tarot? No idea. The woman refused to see them, but after much insistence, she said a few short sentences. "You'll both die in plane crashes. You," pointing at the coworker, "will go soon. You," pointing at grandma, "will take some time, but it will happen." They laughed and left. A few weeks later, the coworker died in a crash. My grandmother, scared to death, pun not intended, quit her job. 30 years later, going offshore to write about a petroleum station, the plane she was in crashed.
That's a heavy story. Your grandmother really lived a whole journey, and it must have been intense for her to receive that prediction. It's wild how life can turn out like that. You can see how a moment like that with the palm reader stuck with her. Those kinds of experiences really shape people, and it's eerie how it all connected in the end. Life has a way of surprising us.
My brother and I were 400 miles from home visiting family. We were hanging out with our cousins who brought us to a house that neither of us had ever been to before, my cousin's friend's house. As we pull up and get out of the car, my brother stops us and says, "I've seen this house before." My cousins and I laugh this off, saying that's impossible. But my brother I insist he's seen it before. "There's a cave in the basement," he said. Now I start laughing because that sounds ludicrous, but my cousins aren't laughing. My brother goes on to describe how the basement looks and where the cave is inside of it, etc. Freaked out everyone, but we did get to smoke in a cool cave in a basement, so there's that.
That's a wild story. Your brother sounds like he could be a little eerie sometimes. It's funny how some places just stick in your memory, even if you haven't been there before. The fact that the basement actually had a cave made it even more interesting. Sometimes unexpected adventures happen. At least you got to enjoy something unique with your cousins. Sounds like a memorable trip despite the creepy vibes.
Worked at a wine store for a while. One time I dropped a very expensive bottle of champagne, can't remember the brand, but it was kept in our specialty wine room. The floor was tile. The bottle dropped, hit the floor, then bounced back up, and I caught it. The bottle didn't break, crack, chip, or anything. It just looked normal except for some extra bubbles. Can't explain it, but it was pretty awesome.
That sounds like a close call. It's always nerve-wracking working around expensive items. The fact that you caught it after it bounced up is kind of wild. A lot of people would have just stood there in shock. At least it turned into a cool story instead of a mess to clean up. And I bet you were relieved that the bottle was fine.
Well, it's nothing close to what I've been reading in this thread. But once in 7th grade, my class was playing kickball, and my best friends ran up, kicked the ball up to his left, and started running to first base. While on his way there, The ball hit a rafter on the ceiling and went hurtling back diagonally towards him, and it hit him in the face as he was running. Funniest thing I've ever seen.
That sounds like a classic school moment. I've had a similar experience where a friend was running during a game and tripped over his own feet. He ended up face first in the grass. Everyone just stopped for a second, not knowing if to laugh or help. Eventually, we all ended up cracking up. Sometimes, those little moments stuck with you just because of how unexpected they are.
So when I was a kid, my mom, little brother, and I were in my mom's old GMC Jimmy, driving home for some family outing. We're on the highway when my mom gets a flat tire. She pulls off the side of the road, and it starts pouring rain. So my mom is trying to change the tire in the pouring rain, and my brother is going crazy for no particular reason. He was a crazy kid. This moving truck pulls over, and these two beefy mover dudes come over and offer to help her. At this point, my mom just wants to get my brother to shut up, and she doesn't feel like she's going to get murdered, so she accepts their offer. After they're done, she takes down the information of the company, so she can call and personally thank their boss. They give her the info and leave. My mom gets home and tries to call the number, but it didn't exist. Confused, she goes to look up the name of the company, only to find out that there's no moving company by that name. To this day, she calls them her beefy guardian angels.
That's a wild story. It's funny how things can turn out like that. Your mom must have been relieved to get the help, especially with your brother being all loud. It's kind of eerie that there's no record of those guys. The whole guardian angels vibe fits perfectly. It's like they just showed up when they were really needed and then vanished. Sometimes you just can't explain stuff like that.
I was driving home a few years ago in a car that was only a year and a half OLD'd. IT was pretty late and the streets were completely empty. I stopped at a red light. Light turned green, the first step on the gas, a few times the engine revs, but the car doesn't move. It sounds exactly like it would if my car was in park. I remember being annoyed and checking to see if the car was in park and open drive. I look up and a huge truck runs the red right where I would have been making my left turn. The truck passes and my car once again drives correctly. My car saved my life.
That's wild. It's crazy how a car issue can end up being a lifesaver. You were just going through a normal drive, and then out of nowhere, something stops you. Must have felt really surreal watching that truck go by. Lucky break for sure. Sometimes, those weird moments really make you think about fate or something. Just goes to show how unexpected life can be.
Me and 3 friends walking home one night were looking up at the really bright moon. As we were looking up, we saw what seemed to be a satellite glazing across the sky. When it got it to the moon, it suddenly took a left, circled the moon, and then zoomed off. I looked at my friends to confirm, and March 4th of us saw it. We all couldn't explain it. We thought it was a satellite that went into the moon's orbit, but that makes no sense, really.
That's a strange experience. It's one of those moments where you question what you saw. It's cool that most of you witnessed it. You start thinking about possibilities, like satellites or something more out there. Those nights can get your imagination going. Sometimes, it feels like the universe is trying to show you something. It's nice to share that kind of mystery with friends.
1988, in the Navy for about 3 years, on my first ship, a Knox-class frigate. On my first deployment to the Mediterranean, standing watch with 4 other guys, at about 3:30 a.m., I decided to go get a soda out of the machine, and on that class of ship, you had to travel through a passageway that was lit with red light at night. On my way back to my watch station, a guy stops me in the P-way that was in red light and asks for a quarter for a soda. I hadn't been on the ship long and didn't know everyone on board yet. So, I handed him 25 cents and noticed his last name on his uniform was Peters. I went back to watch, and the 4 other guys asked, "What took you so long?" Turns out I was gone for like an hour. So I tell them I don't know what they're talking about. All I did was stop and give us and Peters a quarter for a soda, and all 4 of them turned white as ghosts. The senior guy tells me that isn't funny, S.N. Peters was killed on board 3 weeks before I got there, in an accident. I know the guy I gave him money to was real because I touched his hand when I gave him the quarter.
That's a strange story. Being in the Navy, you see things that are hard to explain. That encounter must have been unsettling, especially with the twist about S.N. Peters. It's odd how the mind plays tricks, especially in an environment where you're often on edge. Seeing someone who isn't supposed to be there can really mess with you. Must have made you rethink what you thought you knew about where you were.
I was at this market in Adelaide when I was 16. I was sitting on a bench with my boyfriend and his younger brother, eating ice creams from a food van. We were waiting for his parents to pick us up as the market had finished. As we waited, we watched an old man pull his typical old man car into the car park under a tree, get out and sit in the boot of his car. This was pretty weird, but it got weirder. He took his pants, he was squatting into the boot. He was taking a dump into the boot of his car while we watched. When he was done, he just pulled his pants up and drove off. What?
That's a wild story. I remember a time when I saw something odd at a park. Just hanging out with friends, and out of nowhere, a guy started dancing like nobody was watching. It was kind of funny and confusing. Seems like some people just don't care what others think. I guess we all have our moments of strange behavior in public. Still, that old man's story takes it to another level.
I was doing construction in a supermarket parking lot a few years back, and at the time, I was the only one working while my colleagues were on break. Suddenly, this crowd began encircling some car in the lot. There was an old man in the car, unable to get out of it because he did not receive his insulin injection, so everyone around the car just pounded on the window and waited for the police. I brought a crowbar with me and offered to smash the window, but the entire crowd of about 10 people stopped me from doing so. I kept trying to smash the window so the nurse that he was with could give him a shot, but everyone kept saying it's not your car and you'll be sued for damages, etc., etc. Straight-faced, the guy died in the ambulance once the police showed up to then break the window and rescue the old man. After that day, I realized that people in a critical situation are very useless and will do absolutely nothing to save a life if they think they will be a little hurt or because of judgment. And that guy died because I was stopped by a bunch of dumbass.
That's a tough story. It's wild how people freeze in those moments. They see someone in trouble but just can't step up. I get the urge to act, especially when it's life or death. It's frustrating to think that a little fear of repercussions can cost someone their life. Makes you wonder how to change that behavior in emergencies. Sometimes it just takes one person to break through the crowd mentality.
This one still boggles my mind to this day. While I was in 8th grade, my family took a trip with another family to Reno. On the way there, we stopped by your typical gas station / convenience store complex. My friend and I stood outside the store, waiting for the parents. On the side of the store, in the dark, was a crotchety, long rolled-up rug that had space in the middle, picture like a tube. We just happened to be staring in that direction when we saw some weird-ass shit. Describing what it looks like is a bit inexplicable, because I never saw anything like it. It was basically a large, thick, whitish-brownish, mucousy worm-shaped object that was slowly slithering out of the rug, like a snake. The thing was way too big to be an animal, and it looked really grotesque. It appeared to be animate because it was slithering out. We instantly ran away, and we swear we saw an alien.
That sounds wild. I mean, just hanging out at a gas station and then seeing something like that would freak anyone out. It's interesting how those moments stick with you. I remember a time with friends when we thought we saw something creepy in the woods, and we just bolted. Sometimes, the unknown can really mess with your head. It's funny how our imaginations run wild in those situations.
Before my mom was born, my grandma had a miscarriage. Fast forward, my mom is carrying toddler me up the stairs, in which the wall is decorated with family pictures. I stop my mom in front of a picture of my grandma and tell my mom that it was a picture of my mom. She explains that it's her mom and not mine, in which I replied that she was my mom for a little bit first. A couple of months later, I go running into my mom's room at 5 in the morning to wake my mom up to tell her that I had to go visit my mom today at the cemetery because it was her birthday. Toddler me had no way of knowing this, but I was right. Nothing like that has happened since.
That's an interesting story. Kids sometimes say things that can be surprising. It's wild how you made that connection without knowing the background. It feels like a glimpse into something deeper that you weren't even aware of at that age. Makes you wonder about memories and bonds that aren't easily explained. Life has mysterious ways of connecting us, even if we don't fully understand it yet.
Several years ago, my mom wakes me up in the middle of the night to come look at my dad. She said she was woken up by his body flashing lights. He raised up his shirt, and you could see waves of electricity going through his body, lighting up his stomach and back in the dark. They were so bright that you could see all his blood vessels in his body. This only happened that night and never happened again. We were both baffled to this day.
That's a strange experience. I can't imagine waking up to something like that. It must have been surreal seeing those lights on your dad like that. It's one of those things that just sticks with you. Just a moment you can't explain, and it leaves you questioning everything. It might be something that never gets solved, but those memories can last a lifetime.
A few years ago, my best friend and I were sharing a house out in the country. One of her children was being fussy and wouldn't sleep, so we decided to take a drive down some back roads. About 10 minutes after I started driving, we were pretty far into the boonies of my city, where the street lines are few and far between, and everything is terrifying. I only glimpsed them, but I swear to God I saw a pack, 3 or 4, of the most mismatched creatures ever. They were like little pigs, with human teeth and eyes, but their skin was an odd shade of pink, and it was wrinkly, as if they had all rapidly lost weight. I screamed and floored the gas pedal all the way home. As we neared my house, about 4 houses down, I saw another similar creature that was the same shade of odd pink and had the same texture of skin. This one, however, was taller and standing upright on 2 legs, half hidden in the shadows. We rushed the kids in, but neither of us slept that night. The next day, someone or something had slashed 2 of our car's tires.
That sounds intense. I remember a late-night drive with a friend where we thought we saw something in the trees. Just shadows, but it creeped us out. We sped off, a mix of adrenaline and fear. Turns out, we were just paranoid from not sleeping. It's funny how the imagination works in those quiet places. Crazy things can happen when you're out in the dark like that, even if they end up being nothing.
When I was 14, my best friend and I were hanging out in my parents' basement, playing video games and goofing off. It got to be about 3 a.m., and we just started talking nonsense like we normally do. He was telling some story. I can't recall exactly what it was, but at one point he said fire. Just then, an ember lit up in the basement fireplace, stayed lit for maybe 10 seconds and went out. It was the middle of summer. We had lived there for about 2 years and had never once actually lit a fire in that fireplace. No idea what could have happened.
That's a wild moment. Just chilling in the basement, and then an ember pops up out of nowhere. It's funny how random things like that can happen when you're just hanging out, talking nonsense. It makes you wonder if there was something going on or if it was just one of those weird coincidences. Either way, it sounds like a memorable night.
I was sitting in my living room watching TV one night. A friend was sitting in a chair to my left. On my right was the wall. Through this wall, without a sound, a small, maybe 6 or 7 centimeters diameter, ball of light emerged, floated horizontally for a few feet, slowly lowered to a few inches off the coffee table, and disappeared in a small flash. My friend saw exactly the same thing. We were talking about it a couple of days later, and the kids, who were about 6 and 8 at the time, overheard and informed us that they had seen the same thing on a couple of occasions. None of us were ever able to explain it. Edit. I should also mention that the wall this thing came through was an interior wall. Anything coming through it from outside would have to also pass through another interior wall and the exterior wall first.
That's pretty wild. You and your friend both saw the same thing, and then the kids chime in too. It's strange how those experiences can stick with you. Makes you wonder what else is out there. Sometimes it feels like there are things happening that we just can't explain. I guess it's one of those moments that you just accept and move on, even if it leaves you questioning.
Back in 5th grade, one of my friends had gone to the dentist or doctor and came back to school during recess. She had brought all of our friend group, these little plastic dogs that had legs which could move, so they walked. After recess, we all put our dogs in our pockets and headed to lunch. We got our food and sat at the table. Then one of the girls pulled out her dog, only to realize 2 of its legs were missing. We looked all around the lunchroom, but couldn't find the dog legs, so we gave up. I opened my milk carton, had been closed the whole time, and saw something floating in it. It was the toy dog legs. Somehow, they had gone from attached to the dog in her pocket to floating in my closed milk carton. Everybody freaked out.
That's a pretty weird story. Losing dog legs in a lunchroom sounds like a chaotic moment. Finding them in your milk carton must have been a surprise. Everyone's reaction makes it even funnier. It's wild how things like that stick with you over the years. Kids can really create some random memories, huh? Kind of makes you wonder how they ended up there in the first place.
I walked into a 7 to 11 late at night with my friend. The guys were already inside, eyeing the hot dogs. One of them pointed at us and yelled in a high-pitched voice to his friends, "Oh, SHT, it's the cleaning crew." The 2 smaller guys then proceeded to jump on the backs of the 2 larger guys and get a piggyback ride out of the store. Never saw them again. My friend and I weren't dressed like custodians that night, and the store is open 24 hours. The clerk was watching them as well, so it's not like we prevented theft. Calling out people for being a cleaning crew, still an inside joke between us almost 10 years later.
That night at 7 to 11 was something else. Just walking in, and suddenly, we get mistaken for the cleaning crew. It was unexpected. Watching those guys hop on their friends' backs like that was hilarious. The clerk didn't even react. It's funny how a random moment can turn into an inside joke that lasts years. We still laugh about it sometimes. Simple, but memorable.
In Austin, late 80s. Friday night, and I'm driving home. Pull up at a stop sign. Also stopping to the right of me is a Texas State Trooper car. I look to the right, and the guy driving the State Trooper car is a skinny, shirtless teenager wearing a seatbelt. Looks kind of like the kid from The Deliverance. He looks at me and smiles calmly. I get on I-35 and get into stop-and-go road construction traffic. I see a cop on the roadside, so I pull over, roll down my window, and tell him I saw a naked teenager driving a State Trooper car a quarter-mile back. The cop laughs and tells me to keep driving.
That's a wild story. Imagine pulling up next to a cop and seeing that. It's strange how you can have moments like that out of nowhere. Just driving home, and suddenly, there's a shirtless teen behind the wheel of a trooper car. It must have been a strange sight to witness. The reaction from the other cop was funny too, just telling you to drive on. Some nights can be memorable for the oddest reasons.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.